Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton-Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching my stories, I unearthed tons of intriguing historical information that doesn't end up in my books. So I've created this channel to share these tidbits with you, and I appreciate you stopping by. Alton Glenn Miller, the famed American big band conductor, arranger, composer, trombone player, and recording artist, knew early on he wanted to be a professional musician. Born March 1, 1904 in Clarinda, Iowa, population 3,076, Glenn had two brothers and one sister. Like their father, all four children went by their middle names. The Millers first moved to Nebraska, where Glenn attended grade school, then to Missouri, where he attended high school. By the time he was 14, he had earned enough money, reportedly from milking cows, to purchase his first trombone and play in the town orchestra. He was also part of the school orchestra, but during his senior year, he formed a band with some of his classmates to play dance music. Taking on paying gigs, he was often out of town, including the day of his high school graduation. His mother accepted his diploma on his behalf. He enrolled at the University of Colorado, but only attended off and on, eventually dropping out completely to focus on his music career. He found work with a variety of bands before being hired as a trombonist with Ben Pollock's orchestra in the mid-1920s. In 1928, he began to freelance, working for such bands as the Dorsey Brothers, Benny Goodman, Smith Ballou, and Red Nichols. In 1935, Glenn assembled an American orchestra for British bandleader Ray Noble, developing the arrangement of lead clarinet over four saxophones. At some point, he made his way to California, where in 1936, he was in his first movie appearance as a member of Ray's band in the big broadcast of 1936. Further opportunities in film didn't materialize, and Miller headed back to New York, where he realized he needed to develop a distinct sound if he was going to stand out in the crowd of big bands and well-known artists. He settled on the arrangement of lead clarinet mingled with a tenor sax holding the same note, while three other saxophones harmonized within a single octave. His new style differentiated him from the other bands of the time, and the group began to get notice. Their star was on the rise, but they really got noticed when they performed with the Ink Spots at the Paramount Theater in New York City. CBS signed them to play a recurring series on the Chesterfield Moonlight Serenade radio program. The program ran 3 times a week, beginning in December of 1939. The following year, Miller and the band added an NBC radio program, which meant that Americans across the nation could hear the Glenn Miller Orchestra almost every day of the week. In 1941 and 1942, the band also appeared in movies, the first of which was Sun Valley Serenade with Sonia Henney. After the U.S. began to gear up for war in 1941, the orchestra began touring military bases. Glenn was already undraftable at 38, married and needing corrective eyeglasses. He had been classified 3A for the draft and unlikely to be called for service. But wanting to do more for the war effort, in the summer of 1942, Glenn applied for a U.S. Navy commission. Unsurprisingly, he was rejected. He turned to the Army, who quickly granted him a commission as captain. By entering the military, Glenn gave up an income of about $20,000 a week, which is the equivalent of about $330,000 per week in 2022 dollars. On October 7, 1942, he reported to the 7th Service Command at Omaha in the Army Specialist Corps, and then sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, where he took a 1-month ASC course. At the end of November, Glenn was transferred to the U.S. Army Air Forces by General Hap Arnold and assigned to the Southeast Flying Training Command at Maxwell Field in Alabama, where he received orientation as an Assistant Special Services Officer, traveling to various AAF training bases to learn the mission of the training command. In Montgomery, Alabama, he appeared on NBC's Nationwide Army Hour, and in Birmingham, he performed on WAPI radio with the Rhythmaires, a 15-piece band from the base. Finally, all his training completed, Glenn was assigned on January 1, 1943, to the headquarters of the AAF Technical Training Command at Knollwood Pines in Southern Pines, North Carolina, where he became Director of Bands from the AAF-TTC. He then headed to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where he screened personnel for assignment into the Air Force bands across the U.S. He created an elite unit he would direct himself. The first radio production unit and orchestra broadcast from Hollywood and was commanded by Major Eddie Dunstetter, with Glenn directing the second radio production unit out of New York. Comprised of musicians from major jazz bands and leading orchestras, Glenn stretched the unit further than his civilian band by mingling jazz, popular music, and classics. His weekly series was initially carried by CBS and then moved to NBC in September of 1943. The band worked a grueling schedule with rehearsals, recording, radio, and bass tours. At one part, Glenn started a marching band that used jeeps with drums and string basses aboard. To the dismay of some Army purists, the band performed marching arrangements of jazz rather than the traditional Sousa military marches. However, the Air Force was just fine with whatever Glenn wanted to do. In the months leading up to the 1944 landings at Normandy, General Eisenhower gave a lot of thought to troop morale. Always important, it was now crucial to build up his men. So he sent a cable to Washington asking to transfer Glenn's unit to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force for their combined Allied radio broadcasting service. The cable partially read that the Miller Organization was, quote, the only organization capable of performing the mission required, end quote. The Air Force agreed with the caveat that the unit remain under Air Force control. With all parties finally in agreement, Glenn and the unit flew to London, where they were billeted in Chelsea. However, regular V-1 bombings were occurring in the city, so the group was moved 50 miles north to Bedford. The following day, the building they had been staying in Chelsea was demolished in a raid. By July 1944, Glenn's 51-piece orchestra, that combined U.S., Canadian, and British musicians, started broadcasting multiple programs over the Allied Expeditionary Forces Program, or AEFP. They also appeared on the Voice of America European outlet and the American Broadcasting Station in Europe that broadcast into occupied Europe and Germany, including German-language programs. In addition to the radio work and recordings, the band toured extensively through England. In 1944, Glenn and actor Lieutenant Colonel David Niven, at that point Deputy Director of the Schaeff Broadcasting Unit, requested that the band be moved to France. Schaeff had moved to Versailles, and they felt reliable radio broadcasting could be done from Paris, and this would also give them the opportunity to perform in the Paris area hospitals and for troops on leave in the area. The move was set for mid-December, but before leaving, the band completed their pre-recordings and regular broadcasts. They were scheduled to leave on an Air Transport Command flight from London to Paris on December 14th. Glenn was on standby for a flight leaving on the 13th, but it was canceled because of inclement weather. The flight of the 14th was also canceled for the same reason. However, there were flights coming and going, but he was not approved to fly on them. Frustrated and impatient, Glenn took matters into his own hands when he ran into his friend, Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basel, and Basel offered him a lift on a December 15th flight. Glenn grabbed the chance, and despite the need to fly below ground cover, the plane took off. When the band arrived later on December 18th, they were concerned that Glenn was not there to meet him. Schaeff was contacted, and after a lengthy conversation, a missing aircrew report was filed. Because Basel and Miller were on the plane without clearing any of the proper channels, they were not listed on the report. It was Glenn's administrative officer, Lieutenant Don Haynes, who raised the alarm, having driven the pair to the airport. The plane or the bodies of the men were never found, and on January 20th, 1945, an 8th Air Force Board of Inquiry in England determined that the UC-64 airplane went down over the English Channel due to a combination of human error, mechanical failure, and weather. Remains of the UC-64 and its passengers have never been found, and the 3 officers were officially declared dead on the standard year and 1 day after they disappeared. The band was scheduled to perform that Christmas 1944, but no official word had gone out about Miller's disappearance. Pre-recorded programs were still being played, and outside of the band and Schaaf, few knew he was gone. On Christmas Eve 1944, the world learned that Major Glenn Miller was missing in action. However, the band's mission was too important to stop, and even with the loss of their beloved leader, they played on. By the time the Army Air Forces Band returned to the U.S. in August of 1945, they had made over 300 personal appearances and played for more than 1.25 military personnel in Europe. Millions on both sides of the fight had had their spirits lifted by the music of Glenn Miller. The orchestra was disbanded in November of 1945. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to learn even more history, please stop by my blog, found on my website at www.lindashentonmatchett.com. Please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and podcast channel to see and hear new episodes that are generally released on the 2nd and 4th Friday of every month. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.